What happens when someone walks into a live television interview expecting to control the conversation, only to discover that the guest sitting across from them refuses to play by the rules? And what happens when that guest is Clint Eastwood? That was the question hanging over the studio as Eastwood prepared to face Joy Behar. What began as a seemingly ordinary celebrity interview was about to become something neither the audience nor the panel appeared prepared for. Joy believed she had an opportunity to put one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures under pressure. She had the questions, the platform, and the confidence that she could steer the conversation wherever she wanted. But there was one thing she may not have counted on. Clint Eastwood wasn't interested in being cornered. For decades, Eastwood had built a reputation for saying little, watching carefully, and letting his actions speak louder than his words. That calmness was about to become the most important factor in the entire confrontation. And the first few minutes gave absolutely no indication of what was coming. The audience applauded as Eastwood took his seat, greeted the hosts, and settled into the conversation. Everything appeared friendly, professional, predictable. But across the table, Joy Behar was waiting. She wasn't waiting for an ordinary answer. She was waiting for an opening. And when that opening finally came, she pushed the conversation in a direction Eastwood clearly hadn't expected. What Joy didn't realize was that the moment she tried to ambush him, she was giving him something far more valuable than a defense. She was giving him control of the conversation. And within minutes, the interview would begin turning against the person who thought she was running it. The cameras were already rolling when the atmosphere inside the studio settled into something that felt completely ordinary. The audience applauded as Clint Eastwood took his seat, and for a moment, there was nothing unusual about the interview. No tension, no confrontation, no indication that the conversation was about to take a completely different direction. Whoopi Goldberg welcomed him warmly, introducing him as one of the most recognizable figures in Hollywood. Eastwood nodded politely, offering the audience that familiar, understated smile before settling back into his chair. "Thank you for having me," he said calmly. Whoopi kept the opening light, asking about his latest project and what attracted him to the story. Eastwood explained that he was drawn to stories about people who make mistakes, face consequences, and still search for a way forward. Sarah Haynes leaned in with genuine curiosity. "That idea of second chances seems to come up a lot in your work. Why does that theme continue to interest you?" Eastwood paused before answering. "Because people aren't defined by one moment," he said. "Sometimes they make mistakes. What matters is what they do afterward." The audience responded with quiet approval. Everything was going exactly as expected. Eastwood talked about directing, actors, storytelling, and the lessons he had learned throughout his long career. The other hosts listened attentively, and the conversation remained respectful. But there was something different happening across the table. Joy Behar hadn't said much. She sat quietly, watching Eastwood answer each question. Her expression was difficult to read, but she appeared to be waiting for something. And that silence mattered, because while everyone else was treating the interview like a normal Hollywood conversation, Joy seemed to be waiting for the moment when she could change the subject entirely. Then she finally leaned forward. "Clint, can I ask you something?" The atmosphere changed almost instantly. And this time, everyone noticed. "Clint, can I ask you something?" Joy Behar leaned forward, and the warmth that had filled her voice only moments earlier was gone. The question sounded simple, but the shift in tone was impossible to miss. Eastwood turned toward her. "Sure. What is it?" Joy smiled. "You've spent decades talking about truth, personal responsibility, and redemption. But don't you think some of your public positions have sometimes contradicted those values?" The audience became noticeably quieter. Eastwood didn't react immediately. He simply looked at Joy, as though deciding exactly what she was asking. "Which positions?" Joy continued, mentioning controversial political figures and past public comments associated with Eastwood. She suggested that supporting certain people came with a responsibility to answer for everything those figures represented. Eastwood remained composed. "I think people are responsible for what they say and do," he replied. "But I'm not responsible for every word spoken by someone I may have supported at one point." Joy quickly jumped in. "But that's exactly the point. When someone with your influence takes a public position, don't you think people have a right to question it?" "Of course they do," Eastwood answered. "I'm not saying they don't." "Then why not answer directly?" "I just did." A few audience members laughed nervously. Joy didn't. She pushed harder, arguing that public figures shouldn't expect comfortable interviews when their past statements have generated controversy. Eastwood nodded slowly. Tough questions don't bother me. Joy smiled again. Good, because I have a few. That sentence changed everything. What Joy believed was the beginning of a successful confrontation was actually the moment Eastwood began recognizing the strategy behind the questions. He wasn't becoming defensive. He was becoming more focused. And the more Joy pressed, the clearer one thing became. She wasn't simply asking Eastwood about his work anymore. She was trying to make him defend his entire public identity. But then Eastwood did something she apparently wasn't expecting. He stopped answering the question she was asking and started examining the question itself. Joy, he said calmly, are you asking me because you actually want to know the answer, or because you've already decided what the answer should be? The audience fell silent. Joy's smile disappeared. And suddenly, the ambush had its first problem. Eastwood wasn't trapped. He was paying attention. Joy paused for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the question. I'm asking because people deserve answers, she replied. Then let's be precise, Eastwood said calmly. His voice never rose. That was what made the moment uncomfortable. He wasn't trying to overpower Joy. He wasn't speaking faster. He simply refused to accept the premise she had placed in front of him. Joy brought up past statements and public appearances, suggesting they revealed something deeper about his character. Eastwood listened until she finished. That's your interpretation, he said. But interpretation isn't the same thing as fact. Joy immediately pushed back. So you're saying people shouldn't question you? No. I'm saying they should question what I actually said. That answer landed differently. The audience remained quiet as Eastwood continued. If you're going to challenge me on something I actually said or did. Don't take somebody else's opinion about me and turn it into my statement. Joy leaned closer. But you understand why people connected those things to you. I understand why people might, Eastwood answered. I don't have to agree with them. Joy tried another angle. You've been in this business for decades. Surely you know that public figures have consequences attached to their choices. Absolutely. Then why resist accountability? Eastwood looked at her. Accountability isn't the problem. He paused. Accuracy is. For the first time, Joy seemed to realize that the conversation wasn't moving where she wanted it to go. She had expected Eastwood to defend himself emotionally. Instead, he was forcing every accusation back toward its source. Joy mentioned his political history again. Eastwood calmly separated his personal views from the assumptions being placed around them. Whenever Joy generalized, he asked for specifics. Whenever she suggested motives, he asked for evidence. The more she tried to broaden the argument, the more he narrowed it. And that was becoming a problem for her. Because a confrontation built around broad accusations becomes much harder to sustain when the other person keeps asking one simple question. Exactly what did I say? Joy tried to move forward anyway. But Eastwood wasn't moving. And the audience was beginning to understand why. The man who had spent decades playing characters who rarely spoke unless they had something important to say was now doing exactly that in real time. He wasn't fighting the trap. He was taking it apart. And the next question would force Joy to make an even bigger decision. Joy wasn't prepared for what happened next. Instead of continuing to defend himself, Clint Eastwood leaned back slightly and looked directly at her. Let me ask you something, Joy. The audience became quiet again. Joy raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. You've said you're doing your job by asking difficult questions. Fair enough. But what's the difference between asking a difficult question and trying to provoke somebody? Joy immediately answered. The difference is whether they can handle the question. Eastwood gave a small nod. That's not an answer. A few people in the audience reacted. Joy shifted in her chair. I think it is. No, Eastwood replied. It's an assumption. He explained that a guest refusing to accept a premise didn't automatically mean the guest was afraid of the question. Sometimes, he said, it simply meant the question was poorly framed. Joy insisted that public figures should be challenged. Eastwood agreed. Challenge me. I'm fine with that. Then he paused. But challenge me on my work. Challenge me on my decisions. Ask me why I made something. Ask me what I believe. Ask me what I would do differently. His expression hardened slightly. But don't decide what I believe first, and then ask me questions designed to prove your decision. The room became noticeably quieter. Joy wasn't backing down. So you think I'm trying to trap you? Eastwood looked at her for several seconds. I think you came into this conversation with an answer already written. Joy shook her head. No, I came prepared. There's a difference. That sentence changed the balance of the interview. Until that moment, Joy had been controlling the direction of every question. Now Eastwood was forcing her to explain her own approach. She tried to regain control by saying that viewers expected challenging television. Eastwood nodded. Then give them something better than a fight. Joy frowned. What do you suggest? A conversation. The answer was simple, but it landed hard. Eastwood turned toward the other hosts and briefly returned to discussing filmmaking, explaining what he had learned from decades of directing and working with actors. But the tension remained, because Joy had just discovered something she hadn't expected. The more she tried to put Eastwood on the defensive, the more he was making her defend herself. And now the entire panel was watching the power shift happen in real time. But Joy still had one more angle. And when she used it, the confrontation would become personal. Joy leaned forward again, refusing to let the conversation drift back toward the film. Clint, you keep saying you want a conversation, but you're avoiding the real issue. Eastwood looked at her. What real issue? Your influence. My influence? Yes. You have millions of people who listen to you. You don't get to separate yourself from the consequences of the things you've supported. Eastwood nodded slowly. I've never said I was separate from consequences. Then answer the question. I've answered several. Not the one I'm asking. Eastwood's expression remained calm. Maybe because you're asking a question you already answered for yourself. The audience reacted with a low murmur. Joy's voice sharpened. No, I'm asking you to take responsibility. Eastwood leaned forward. Responsibility for what? Joy began listing the positions and controversies she believed were connected to him. Eastwood listened without interrupting. Then he said, You've spent several minutes telling me what I believe. Joy immediately responded, Because your history tells us something. My history tells you something, Eastwood corrected. It doesn't give you permission to rewrite my words. Whoopi attempted to step in. Let's bring this back to the film. Joy shook her head. No, I think this matters. Eastwood turned toward her. Does it? Yes. Then let me ask you something. Joy folded her arms. What? Who are you really interviewing right now? Joy looked confused. What do you mean? Are you interviewing the filmmaker sitting in front of you, or are you interviewing the version of me you've created in your head? The studio fell silent. Joy stared at him. That's unfair. Is it? Yes. Then explain why. Joy opened her mouth but hesitated. Eastwood continued. I came here prepared to talk about filmmaking. You decided that wasn't interesting enough. That's not what I said. You didn't have to. The tension became impossible to ignore. Eastwood's voice remained quiet. You keep saying you're asking tough questions. Fine. Tough questions are welcome. But there's a difference between challenging someone and trying to define them before they've even answered. Joy pushed back again. This is television, Clint. People expect honesty. Eastwood nodded. Then let's be honest. He paused. If the goal was really to understand me, you would have asked me what I think. He looked directly at her. Instead, you've spent this entire interview telling me what you think I think. That was the moment the balance shifted again. And Joy suddenly realized the confrontation she had planned wasn't going according to plan at all. But she wasn't finished. And her next remark would push Eastwood closer to his breaking point. Joy's expression hardened. She had spent the entire conversation trying to regain control. But every time she pushed Eastwood into a corner, he somehow turned the pressure back toward her. So she changed tactics. If you're so confident about your legacy, Clint, Joy said, maybe you should accept that your best days are behind you. The studio went silent. Eastwood didn't move. Joy continued. You've had a remarkable career, but perhaps you're not the person people need to hear from anymore. A few audience members gasped. Whoopi immediately looked toward Joy. Joy! But Joy wasn't stopping. You can't live forever on the reputation you built decades ago. Eastwood slowly turned toward her. For several seconds, he said nothing. That silence was more powerful than any angry response could have been. Then he finally spoke. You finished. Joy crossed her arms. I said what I believe. No, Eastwood replied. You said what you wanted to say. Joy shook her head. What's the difference? The difference is respect. Her face tightened. Respect has to be earned. Eastwood nodded. Agreed. He leaned forward slightly. But you've confused respect with obedience. The audience reacted immediately. Joy's voice rose. I'm not asking you to obey me. Then stop trying to force me into an answer you wrote before I spoke. Joy pointed toward him. You came on this show expecting everyone to treat you like some untouchable legend. Eastwood's expression remained controlled. I've never asked anyone to treat me that way. Then why are you so offended? I'm not offended. He paused. I'm disappointed. That answer seemed to hit harder than anger would have. Joy stared at him. Disappointed in what? In the interview. He looked around the panel. I came here expecting questions about filmmaking. I expected criticism. I expected disagreement. That's part of the job. Then he looked directly at Joy. What I didn't expect was someone deciding that humiliating the guest was more important than understanding him. Joy scoffed. Humiliating you? Clint, you're not that fragile. Eastwood gave a faint smile. Neither are you. The audience murmured. But that's not the point. His voice became even quieter. The point is what happens when someone mistakes confrontation for courage. Joy's expression changed. For the first time, she appeared to understand that she had gone too far. But pride wouldn't let her retreat. If you don't like the questions, she said, you can always leave. Eastwood looked at her. And this time, he didn't answer immediately, because she had just given him the one option he needed. If you don't like the questions, you can always leave. Joy's words remained hanging in the studio. Eastwood looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Maybe I will. The audience reacted immediately. Joy seemed surprised by how calmly he said it. You're really going to walk away because someone asked you uncomfortable questions. Eastwood shook his head. No, I'm walking away because you've stopped asking questions. Joy frowned. What does that mean? It means you're making statements and calling them questions. The room went quiet again. Eastwood continued, his voice measured. A real question gives the person sitting across from you a chance to answer. You haven't been doing that. Joy tried to interrupt. I've given you plenty of chances. Eastwood raised one hand slightly. And I've answered you. He turned briefly toward the audience. If somebody wants to disagree with me, that's fine. If somebody wants to criticize my films, my decisions, or my career, that's fine too. I've been criticized for most of my life. He looked back at Joy. But criticism doesn't require disrespect. Joy stared at him. Eastwood then delivered the point that completely changed the atmosphere. You had a chance to ask me about decades of filmmaking. You could have asked about mistakes, lessons, actors I've worked with, stories I wish I'd told differently, or what I've learned from a lifetime in this business. He paused. Instead, you decided the most important thing was trying to make me angry. Joy shook her head. That's not what I was doing. Eastwood answered immediately. Then what were you doing? She hesitated. And that hesitation said more than an argument could. Eastwood continued. That's the problem. When the guest has to spend more time defending the question than answering it, the interview has already failed. The audience became completely silent. Joy attempted one final challenge. So you think you've won? Eastwood gave a faint smile. This isn't a competition. He stood slowly. That's something you seem to have forgotten. The studio froze. Eastwood reached for his microphone. Joy suddenly realized what was happening. You can't just leave. Eastwood looked at her. Watch me. And in that instant, the person who had entered the interview expecting to be challenged had become the person deciding when the interview was over. But Eastwood wasn't finished. He still had one final statement to make, and this time he wanted everyone watching at home to hear it. Eastwood slowly removed the microphone from his jacket. The studio was completely silent. Joy stared at him, apparently still believing she could stop what was happening. If you walk out now, she said, people are going to think you couldn't handle the questions. Eastwood paused. Then he turned toward her. I've handled difficult questions for a very long time. His voice was calm. That's not why I'm leaving. Joy waited. I'm leaving because this stopped being an interview. The audience reacted with a mixture of surprise and nervous applause. Joy shook her head. No, Clint, you don't get to decide that. Eastwood looked around the panel before answering. Actually, I do. He placed the microphone on the table. I came here to talk about a film. I came here because I respect the audience and I respect the people who work on this program. Then he looked directly at Joy. But I won't sit here and be treated like a target simply because someone wants a dramatic moment. Joy immediately fired back. You're making yourself the victim. Eastwood nodded slightly. No, I'm making a choice. That sentence quieted the room again. He turned toward the main camera. To everyone watching, disagreement is fine. Questions are fine. Criticism is fine. But a conversation only works when both people are actually allowed to speak. He paused. When that disappears, there's no reason to continue. Joy looked increasingly frustrated. This is live television, Clint. I know. You can't just walk away. Eastwood gave a faint smile. That's where you're mistaken. He straightened his jacket and took one final look around the studio. You don't have to agree with me. You don't even have to like me. Then his eyes returned to Joy. But if you invite someone onto your show, at least give them the basic courtesy of letting them answer. Joy opened her mouth, but Eastwood raised a hand. No more. 2 simple words. The room froze. We're done. He turned and began walking away. Joy called after him. Clint. He didn't stop. The audience watched in stunned silence as Eastwood continued toward the exit. And suddenly, the entire confrontation had been reduced to one unmistakable fact. Joy had invited him into the conversation believing she controlled the room. But Clint Eastwood had just decided when it was over. And what happened after he left would make the situation even more explosive. For several seconds after Eastwood disappeared from the set, nobody seemed to know what to say. The studio was frozen. The audience remained unusually quiet, as if everyone was still processing what had just happened. Even the other hosts appeared caught between disbelief and discomfort. Joy sat motionless. The confidence she had displayed earlier was gone. She looked toward the empty chair where Eastwood had been sitting, then back toward the cameras. This is unbelievable, she finally said. But her voice lacked the certainty it had carried minutes earlier. Whoopi leaned toward her. Joy, we probably need to take a breath. Joy shook her head. He walked out because he didn't want to answer. Whoopi looked at her carefully. That's not exactly what happened. The audience murmured. Joy immediately turned toward them. What? You wanted me to let him avoid every question. Sarah Haynes remained quiet for a moment before speaking. I don't think anyone is saying that. Joy looked around the table. Then what are you saying? Sarah hesitated. I'm saying the conversation changed. That sentence landed heavily. Because everyone knew it was true. The interview had started with filmmaking. It had moved into politics, then criticism, then personal accusations, and finally a confrontation that had ended with one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures walking off the set. Behind the cameras, producers were desperately trying to regain control. The hosts were receiving instructions, but the tension was still obvious. Joy looked toward the main camera. Well, that certainly wasn't how I expected this interview to go. The audience remained divided. Some people applauded. Others sat silently. Whoopi tried to transition away from the confrontation, but the atmosphere wouldn't allow it. Everyone was thinking about the same question. Had Joy actually won the argument? Or had the ambush completely backfired? And before the program could even move forward, another problem was already developing. People watching at home had witnessed everything. The moment Eastwood stood up. The moment he removed his microphone. The moment he said, "We're done." And now, millions of viewers were about to decide for themselves who really controlled that interview. By the time the program moved on, the confrontation was already becoming the moment everyone was talking about. Viewers began discussing what had happened almost immediately. The exchange between Clint Eastwood and Joy Behar spread rapidly, with the most attention focused on one unexpected detail. Eastwood had never needed to raise his voice. That became the part people kept returning to. Joy had started the conversation believing she could pressure him into defending himself. But the longer the confrontation continued, the more the balance shifted. People debated every moment. Was Joy simply asking difficult questions? Or had she pushed the interview too far? Had Eastwood overreacted? Or had he simply refused to participate in a conversation that had become personal? The arguments continued, but one thing was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. The ambush hadn't produced the outcome Joy expected. Instead of leaving Eastwood embarrassed or defensive, the confrontation had created a completely different narrative. His calm responses became the center of attention. His decision to walk away became the defining moment. And his final statement about the difference between criticism and disrespect became the line audiences remembered most. The discussion spread beyond the original interview. People began revisiting the exchange, analyzing Joy's questions, Eastwood's answers, and the moment when the entire power dynamic changed. Some defended Joy, arguing that public figures should be challenged. Others argued that Eastwood had every right to refuse a conversation that had become increasingly personal. But even among those who disagreed with Eastwood, there was recognition that he had controlled his emotions remarkably well. And that was the psychological twist nobody expected. Joy had attempted to provoke a reaction. Instead, she gave Eastwood the opportunity to demonstrate restraint. The more the confrontation circulated, the more the original questions seemed to disappear. It was no longer simply about what Joy had asked. It was about what happened when the person being challenged refused to become the person being controlled. The interview had started with Joy asking the questions. It ended with everyone asking whether she had made the biggest mistake of the entire segment. And that question was about to define the fallout. So why did Clint Eastwood ultimately control the moment? It wasn't because he shouted louder. It wasn't because he had more people on his side. And it certainly wasn't because he refused to answer difficult questions. In fact, Eastwood made something very clear throughout the confrontation. Difficult questions were never the problem. The problem was what happened when questions stopped being questions and became accusations. That distinction changed everything. Joy entered the conversation believing pressure would force Eastwood into a defensive position. But Eastwood refused to react emotionally. Every time the conversation became more aggressive, he became more deliberate. And psychologically, that completely changed the balance. Because when one person is trying to provoke another and the other person refuses to lose control, the person applying the pressure can suddenly become the one under pressure. That was exactly what happened. Eastwood didn't need to prove that he was the toughest person in the room. He simply remained composed long enough for the confrontation to reveal itself. His strongest moments weren't the sharpest insults. They were the moments when he slowed everything down and asked simple questions. What exactly did I say? What are you really asking? Are you looking for an answer, or have you already decided what you believe? Those questions forced the conversation into territory Joy hadn't prepared for. And eventually, Eastwood recognized something important. He didn't have to stay. That may have been the most powerful decision of the entire interview. Walking away wasn't surrender. It was control. He refused to allow someone else to determine how long he would participate in a conversation that had stopped being productive. And that's why the confrontation resonated so strongly. The real lesson wasn't about winning an argument. It was about understanding when an argument is no longer worth having. Joy thought she was creating pressure. Instead, she revealed it. Eastwood thought he was simply answering questions. Instead, he ended up exposing the difference between confrontation and control. And by the time he walked away, the question wasn't whether he had survived the ambush. The question was whether the ambush had ever been his to survive in the first place. And that is what made this confrontation so unexpected. Joy Behar entered the interview believing she had the advantage. She had the questions, the platform, and the confidence that she could push Clint Eastwood into a corner. But she underestimated one thing. Eastwood didn't need to win by shouting. He didn't need to insult anyone. And he didn't need to stay until the final question. He simply recognized the moment when the conversation stopped being productive, and he walked away. What started as a routine interview ended with an unforgettable power shift, leaving the studio stunned and the audience questioning who had actually controlled the conversation. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't another argument. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to say, "We're done." So what do you think? Did Clint Eastwood handle the confrontation the right way? Or should he have stayed and answered every question Joy Behar asked? Let us know your opinion in the comments. And if this confrontation made you look at live interviews differently, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us for more dramatic celebrity moments, unexpected confrontations, and stories you won't want to miss. Because when one person thinks they're setting the trap, they may not realize they've already stepped into one themselves. And in this case, the ambush didn't break Clint Eastwood. It backfired.